The World Bank revises its 2024 growth forecast for South Asia to 6.4%, up from 6.0%. U.S. consumer prices rises 0.2% in September. And Israel's finance ministry reports a budget deficit of 8.8 billion shekels in September. Welcome to the Economic Bulletin, where we present comprehensive coverage and expert insights on key updates regarding pivotal economic trends and financial shifts. Welcome back. We start with the United States, where the Labor Department announced that consumer prices rose 0.2% in September, slightly more than expected. However, the annual inflation rate eased to 2.4%, the smallest increase since February 2021. The slowdown in inflation could keep the Federal Reserve on track for a potential interest rate cut next month. In August, the annual CPI rose by 2.5%, showing a continued cooling of price pressures. This moderation, particularly in motor vehicle inventories, could temper expectations for robust economic growth in the third quarter. On a year-on-year basis, inventories increased by 0.6% in August. Private inventory investment had contributed significantly to the 3.0% growth rate in the second quarter, though inventories and trade remain volatile components of GDP. Still in the United States, where the Congressional Budget Office projected a federal deficit of $1.834 trillion for fiscal year 2024. Marking the highest post-COVID deficit. This increase is attributed to rising debt, interest costs, and higher spending on Social Security, Medicare, and health insurance tax credits. The 2024 deficit is up 11% from the $1.7 trillion gap in fiscal 2023, though it is slightly below the $1.9 trillion estimate from June. The final budget report from the United States Treasury is expected later this month. Furthermore, the Labor Department stated that the number of Americans filing new unemployment claims jumped by 33,000 to 258,000 for the week ending October 5th. The surge was partly driven by the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and furloughs at Boeing, where a nearly 4-week strike has affected operations. On another note, President Joe Biden announced that his administration will pressure companies to stabilize prices as Hurricane Milton hits Florida. The aim is to ensure that residents have access to necessities like gasoline and flights without facing inflated prices. As Hurricane Milton approaches Florida's Gulf Coast, residents have only hours to evacuate or take shelter from the impending storm, which threatens lives with surging storms, high winds, and heavy rainfall. This region is still recovering from the impacts of Hurricane Helene, which struck just 2 weeks ago.
Kamala and I are going to keep pressure on the companies so prices stay stable on gasoline, flights, and goods people need.
As Hurricane Milton made landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast late Wednesday, the U.S. economy is poised for significant repercussions, with early estimates indicating potential losses in the tens of billions of dollars.
As Hurricane Milton approaches Florida's Gulf Coast, the U.S. economy is bracing for significant consequences. The Category 3 storm made landfall late Wednesday, threatening nearly 3% of U.S. GDP, according to Oxford Economics. Early estimates suggest damage could slow fourth-quarter economic growth, with losses potentially reaching tens of billions of dollars. In a concerning projection, RBC Capital estimates that Milton could cause up to $60 billion in losses for the global insurance industry. This figure is comparable to Hurricane Ian in 2022 and could lead to higher reinsurance prices in 2025, potentially benefiting certain insurance stocks. Insurers have already begun increasing rates and excluding high-risk policies in response to rising disaster losses. Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank President Raphael Bostic expressed concern about the storm's impact, particularly following Hurricane Helene's recent effects. He emphasized the need for the Federal Reserve to remain prepared for any prolonged economic fallout. Experts also predict a negative effect on employment, with Hurricane Helene expected to reduce October job figures by 40,000 to 50,000, a trend that Milton could further exacerbate. The damage from the storm, particularly in sectors like tourism and housing, may stretch recovery efforts well into 2024.
Joining us today to discuss the latest developments in the American economy is Dr. Usama El-Sharaibi, Director of the Emory Economic Development Initiative. Dr. Usama, welcome to Q News. We're glad to have you with us on the Economic Bulletin. Let me first ask you, how significant is the potential impact of Hurricane Milton on the U.S. GDP, particularly in the fourth quarter of 2024?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's right away we will see a lot of property damage, business closure, and a drop in income as people deal with lost wages or ruined workplaces. So the key sectors, like you said in the report, beautiful report, by the way, tourism, agriculture, real estate, they will be hardest hit. So insurance companies, as you said also in the report, will face high claims, which might put pressure on liquidity. So the biggest problem will be a liquidity crunch. So in fact, this storm and the previous storm, Helene, triggered a severe liquidity crunch, while actually the GDP, if you could say, the month of September was a good month for actually the U.S. economy, because the interest rate went down. As you see today in the Financial Times or in the New York Times, it was positive. However, I think the two compound effects or the negative effects of the two hurricanes will lead to a severe liquidity crunch, if you could say, and which mean also that we could have, the hurricane will cause major supply chain shock, which will also has a huge effect on the GDP in general.
I want to delve more into the key sectors. Can you explain how natural disasters like hurricanes directly affect economic growth, particularly in the aforementioned key sectors such as tourism, housing, and infrastructure?
Yes. So let me talk about what we call first secondary effects. For example, there will be transportation disruption, can slow actually trade. Consumer spending could shrink as people redirect funds toward repairing the houses, huge damage. It's really so sad. Medical costs are really very important. And these shifts can create knock-on effects leading to job losses, shifts in demand. So let's go back to, for example, reconstruction. Reconstruction may boost employment in the construction field, but this demand for building materials would cause actually price inflation. And so in other words, if I may say...
Dr. Usama, sorry for interrupting you, but I would like to shed light on the global insurance industry. With the RBC Capital estimating up to $60 billion in losses for the global insurance industry, how will this affect insurance premiums and reinsurance rates in the United States?
Oh, it will be, huge. I think the claims. So let me say two things first of all. So there is, that we have something called FEMA in America that plays a very important role in providing relief funds, logical support, etc., for people. However, that doesn't cover actually the insurance problems and the high claims that insurance will do, because they will not be it will not be easy for these insurance companies to even if we know that that Florida is resilient and they recover quickly, etc. Still, the premiums will go up tremendously, which will be a huge problem for actually the consumers.
Now, let's integrate the unemployment aspect into our conversation. Given the projection that Hurricane Helene might have reduced job figures by up to 50,000, what effect could Hurricane Milton have on employment in the affected regions?
Oh yeah, it will absolutely play a critical role in, for example, it depends on the scale of the disaster in each region. Some regions, for example, in Florida, have been devastated, which means that small businesses will, in particular, will be very vulnerable for prolonged, actually, closures, and which again lead to a strong liquidity problem. So in other words, if you could say, let me also.
Dr. Osama, speaking of vulnerability, if you could specify which industries are most vulnerable to job losses due to hurricane-related disruptions, and how long might it take for employment to recover?
Oh, yes. When you talk about Florida, you talk about tourism, you talk about coastal areas, you talk about substantial decline in revenue. So because you have damaged hotels, you have damaged structure, you have damaged beaches, and then it means also fewer visitors will come to Florida. And so these are really very key sectors that are going to be, it will take time to rebuild. However, as you know, Florida is still resilient and will be able to resolve this problem in a couple of months, but at least for the couple 6 months will be very problematic. I hope.
Dr. Osama, let's look at the wider picture. Like, how long could the economic recovery from Hurricane Milton take, especially in sectors like tourism, real estate, and retail? And what role can federal and state level stimulus or aid programs play in accelerating recovery efforts?
Well, so if resources are slow or misallocated, the economic drought could last for years. So in that sense, I do think that, an efficient resource allocation to the areas will speed up actually recovery. However, it all depends on how, how to direct grants and to these areas to stabilize people's finances, because I know that investment in infrastructure is problematic. Especially what has to happen is they have to make this infrastructure more resilient for the next hurricane. So it's gonna take time, in my view, to lead to kind of financial stabilization through loans and to these businesses to rebuild and to reopen.
Thank you, Dr. Osama El-Sharaibi. Sorry for interrupting you due to the shortage of time. That was Director of the Emory Economic Development Initiative. Thank you so much for your insights. On a global note, the World Bank has revised its 2024 growth forecast for South Asia to 6.4%, up from 6.0%, citing strong domestic demand in India and faster recoveries in crisis-hit countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. India's growth projection for the fiscal year ending March 2025 was increased to 7%, boosted by improved agricultural output and higher private consumption. World Bank Vice President Martin Razor highlighted South Asia as the fastest growing emerging economy, with expected annual growth of 6.2% over the next 2 years. He emphasized the region's potential for even higher growth with continued economic reforms and global integration. The World Trade Organization has slightly raised its global trade growth forecast for 2023 to 2.7%, up from its previous estimate of 2.6%. In 2025, trade volumes are expected to increase by 3%, contingent on stability in the Middle East. The World Trade Organization's report highlighted that trade is recovering from the inflation-driven slump of 2023, but remains vulnerable to regional conflict, particularly in the Middle East. The World Trade Organization noted risks from diverging monetary policies among major economies, which could cause financial instability and impact debt servicing for lower-income nations. In Asia, the Bank of Japan announced that the wholesale inflation picked up in September, rising 2.8% year-on-year, surpassing market expectations. This acceleration, up from 2.6% in August, was driven by a surge in rice prices due to poor weather and increased demand from foreign tourists. However, the yen's rebound led to 2.6% decline in import costs, marking the first drop in 8 months. This decline in the yen-based import price index was influenced by government subsidies to curb utility bills and cheaper raw material imports. The People's Bank of China announced that it will begin accepting applications from financial institutions to join a newly created funding scheme worth 500 billion yuan, approximately $70.62 billion, aimed at bolstering the capital market. Eligible securities firms, fund companies, and insurers can use assets like bonds and stock ETFs as collateral for highly liquid assets. The PBOC introduced this facility to boost market confidence following a recent drop in Chinese stocks. Analysts see the scheme as a liquidity boost for non-bank financial institutions, though concerns remain over participation and operational details. In Europe, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors reported that Britain's housing market saw further recovery in September as house prices, sales, and inquiries all increased. The house price balance reached plus 11, the first positive reading since October 2022. Surveyors expect continued growth, with 54% predicting price increases over the next year. Sales forecasts also improved, with a net balance of plus 45 for the next 12 months. However, the rental market remains under pressure as tenant demand exceeds supply. The German Economy Ministry said that the economy is expected to contract by 0.2% in 2024, marking the second consecutive year of negative growth. This would make Germany the only G7 nation to see economic contraction for 2 straight years. The revised forecast follows an earlier projection of 0.3% growth for 2024, as hopes for a second-half recovery failed to materialize. Germany's economy, already the weakest among large Eurozone economies in 2023, saw a 0.3% GDP decline last year. The last time Germany experienced 2 consecutive years of contraction was in 2002 to 2003. Ukraine's Statistics Service announced that the consumer inflation increased to 8.6% year-on-year in September, up from 7.5% in August. The rise was driven by higher energy prices, increased business costs, and a lower harvest. Monthly inflation reached 1.5%, with significant contributions from rising utility tariffs and electricity prices. Ukraine's energy sector continues to face challenges due to intensified Russian attacks on its infrastructure. In the Middle East, Canada's Minister of International Development, Ahmed Hussein, announced that Ottawa will provide an additional $15 million in humanitarian aid to Lebanon. This funding will support Canadian and international organizations in delivering essential services such as food, water, and emergency health care to civilians. Additionally, Canada will match up to $6 million in donations to the Canadian Red Cross Lebanon Humanitarian Needs Appeal and the Humanitarian Coalition's Lebanon Emergency Appeal from September 24 to November 3, 2024. This new funding is part of the $10 million in humanitarian assistance announced on September 28, with $4 million allocated to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Food Programme. Israel's finance ministry reported a budget deficit of 8.8 billion shekels, $2.3 billion in September, primarily due to increased expenses to fund their military actions in Gaza and Lebanon. The 12-month deficit rose to 8.5% of GDP, surpassing the 2024 target of 6.6%. Since the war began, military spending has exceeded 103 billion shekels, $27.35 billion. The Bank of Israel expects the deficit to decrease to 7.5% by year-end. In contrast, tax revenues increased by 9.6% in September and by 2.6% over the first 9 months of 2024. In the tech world, 3 cryptocurrency firms, Godbit, ZM Quant, and CLS Global, along with 15 individuals, have been charged with extensive fraud and market manipulation following an investigation that marked the FBI's first effort to create a digital token to aid in combating crime. Federal prosecutors in Boston reported that the investigation resulted in 4 arrests and agreements from 5 individuals to plead guilty, alongside the seizure of over $25 million worth of cryptocurrency. Acting U.S. Attorney Joshua Levy described the case as a combination of new age technology meeting an old school fraud, specifically a pump and dump scheme. Wall Street opened lower on Thursday as hotter than expected September inflation data reinforced expectations of a 25 basis point rate hike by the Federal Reserve at its upcoming meeting. In early trading, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 0.18%, the S&P 500 0.27%, and the Nasdaq Composite lost 69.40 points, or 0.8%. In Asia, Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 edged up 0.3%. Australia's S&P/ASX 200 rose 0.4%. South Korea's Kospi added 0.2%. In Europe, the Pan-European Stoxx 600 index was down 0.2%, with tech, mining, and travel and leisure stocks leading morning declines. Oil prices rose more than 1% on Thursday, underpinned by a spike in fuel demand as a hurricane barreled into Florida, with Middle East supply risks also in focus. Brent crude futures rose 1.6% to $77.78 a barrel by 13 to 30 GMT. U.S. West Texas Intermediate WTI futures were up 1.6% at $74.40. That's all for now. Here's a roundup of today's key headlines. The World Bank revises its 2024 growth forecast for South Asia to 6.4%, up from 6.0%.